Hello and welcome to the BA Knowledge Share. In this episode, I will cover traceability of requirements, which is part of the Chapter 5 of the Requirements Lifecycle Management. That being said, in the previous episode, we went through the introduction to Requirements Lifecycle Management and how it relates to the backend model. That being said, what is tracing of requirements and what is its purpose? Traceability of requirements is used to ensure requirements and designs at different levels are aligned to one another. So think of it as more like relationship between those requirements, backward and forward. It also helps in managing the effects of change. Now, traceability, in addition to managing the effects of change, it helps in faster and simpler impact analysis. It helps in a more reliable discovery of inconsistencies and gaps in requirements. It helps in building deeper insights into scope and complexity of change, and it helps in reliable assessment of which requirements have been addressed and which have not. So think of, in this diagram, think of it as backward and forward traceability. Process traceability maps the traceability of requirements and understanding how does it connect to the objective. And then the backward is more so tied to how does that requirement connect to the solution and test cases. What are some of the elements of tracing requirements? There are basically three. Think of it as level of formality, and very importantly, the level of formality of traceability increases as the number of requirements increase. The relationship between requirements and understanding what are those relationships. Now, there's four sorts of relationships. One is derived. So this helps provide an understanding of how one requirement is derived from another requirement. In this case, as an example, solution requirements depend on business requirements or are derived from business requirements. The dependencies, understanding how one requirement is dependent on another requirement. Example, the recovery of username and password might be directly dependent on the creation of the username and password. So the next one is satisfaction or satisfying. The solution components are implemented to satisfy the functional requirements. So that's one sort of relationship. And validation. Validation is a relationship between a requirement as well as a test case. The last element in this case is traceability repository. Traceability is documented and maintained in accordance with the methods identified by the business analysis approach. Now, you may not have a formal business analysis approach given the agile methodology or even within a smaller SDLC project. However, you should have a sense of how you're going to approach the requirements and how you're going to manage changes to those requirements. Now, there's specific guidelines and tools that you may want to consider as a business analyst. Number one is understanding the domain knowledge. Number two is the information management approach, meaning how are you going to manage all that information? The third is legal or regulatory information. And the last is requirements management tool or repository. A couple of techniques to utilize while building a traceability matrix or building a traceability system is basically understanding your business rules, functional decomposition using that method, which breaks down a specific category into its finest components, process modeling, feature state process, as well as tracing requirements through that feature state process. So we spoke about a forward and backward looking traceability, scope modeling, visually depict scope. And there are pretty much all stakeholders that you will be using in this task of the requirements lifecycle management. So if you can see here visually, you're going to utilize your domain SME, your implementation SME, your operational support team, project manager, tester, customers, end users, sponsors, supplier. Let's look into the case study for tracing requirements. Now, we spoke about Amanda. Amanda is a business analyst that has been hired to put together requirements, document those, and analyze those for a pizza place. And the pizza place is currently primarily offline and they do have a web presence, but they want to move all their sales online because of COVID and the digital transformation. Now, in this case, Amanda has her scope, she has a couple of requirements, and she understands the design. And Amanda laid out the traceability approach and the business analysis approach. Now, she understands that there are a lot of requirements, and this project per se has a heavy health regulation requirements. So she keeps that in mind as she builds out the tracing of the requirements. She has built a matrix that tells her what the functional requirement is, how it ties to business objectives, forward-looking, and how the requirement ties back to the test cases and solution going backward. She keeps in mind the four relationships: derivation, depend, satisfy, and validate. So remember, we spoke about this a few slides ago, where you're deriving a requirement, you're understanding the dependencies of those requirements, you're understanding how one requirement satisfies the other requirement as a solution requirements to functional requirements, and validation, meaning how a requirement is validated through test cases. She uses a couple of elements, guidelines, and rules. One is a domain knowledge to understand the relationships, dependencies, and requirements. She uses information management approach to manage through the tracing of requirements. She also uses and understands the legal or regulatory information, in this case, the health regulations, in order to build out the requirements as well as understand dependencies. And then the last one is she utilizes a requirements management tool or repository. In this case, she chooses to use a simple Excel spreadsheet that she just uploads to Confluence. Now, she uses a couple of techniques, and the first one she uses is a business rules analysis. So because this is a new effort, she built out a business rules repository, so she can understand how each rule is dependent on the other rule and how it traces to each requirement. She utilizes functional decomposition to break down how the overall categories need to be organized. She employs a process modeling to trace requirements to future state processes. She uses scope modeling to visually depict scope and trace the requirements to the scope that the requirements support. Now, in this case, she works with a couple of stakeholders. She works with Ben, who is the customer, the domain subject matter expert, and the end user. Now, Ben is basically as good as the end user because he works with the customers on a day-to-day basis. He understands the customers. He has a lot of data around customers. Now, in some cases, she may work with actual restaurant customers, not Ben, to kind of build out the traceability, help understand the relationships. She works with Sean, who is the vice president, and he's a sponsor. She works with a solution architect, who is the implementation SME, Ravi and the team that are operational support. She works with project manager Tim and Eileen, who is a QA lead. There is no vendor in this case, so she doesn't have a supplier that she needs to work with. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Traceability of Requirements, tied to Chapter 5 of Requirements Lifecycle Management in the BABOK. Please do consider subscribing to this channel, as well as going to our website, which is baknowledgeshare.com, which is B as in boy, baknowledgeshare.com, as well as joining or visiting our Facebook group, the links of which have been provided below. Thank you so much.